This is London, one of the largest and most successful cities on Earth.
Wow. Its story spans 2,000 years of daring invasions, catastrophic fire, heroic ambition, and astonishing technological transformations. From the Romans to the Tudors, from the Vikings to the Victorians.
For years, this was the capital of the world, ruling over an empire of billions. So how did London rise up from an uninhabitable marshland to become the thriving 21st century city we see today?
In this series, we'll reveal the crucial events that changed the very shape and size of London.
I'll be digging down into the latest research to uncover conflict, betrayal, and power politics.
I'll be getting special access to some of the city's most extraordinary sights.
And I'll be exploring the innovation and engineering brilliance that gave rise to London's most famous landmarks.
So join us as we go on an amazing journey
Absolutely brilliant.
to discover exactly how this incredible city was created. Our story began with London's Roman origins.
This is original Roman outer facing.
These stones were placed here by the Romans 2,000 years ago.
Absolutely.
Then, after bitter invasions by the Saxons and Vikings, the city emerged triumphant as the country's capital.
In this chapter of the story, we'll track how London transforms yet again. As we travel from medieval London, oh wow, to Tudor London and the reign of the unforgettable Henry VIII. Few eras can have had as much of an impact on London as the one at which we've arrived today. In our journey to map the capital's evolution, we're now at the 13th century. London was about to become one of the world's greatest cities, an esteemed centre of power that would dominate Europe and beyond. It was now a city of 80,000 people and the capital of the country. But it was split into two competing areas. To the east, there was the walled city, originally built by the Romans. Here, merchants controlled the purse strings. And over in the west, 2 miles upriver, was Westminster, owned by the monarchy. This small piece of land outside the walled city of London had become incredibly important in the story of our capital. There was a large stone church here, known as Westminster, to distinguish it from St. Paul's Cathedral in the east. And this is how it looks today. Westminster Abbey is one of the most recognisable landmarks in London. It was built to tower over the capital, like a billboard to advertise the king's royal authority and to lord it over the merchants in the east.
Isn't it extraordinary? But imagine coming here in the Middle Ages when your house was, what, 2 stories, maybe 3 stories high? This is 5 or 6 times higher. People would have been stunned and amazed.
To tell me more about why it was built, I'm being shown around by the country's foremost expert, Professor David Carpenter.
Wow, it is incredible in here. So beautiful.
It was designed to be. It was designed to be the most magnificent church in the world.
And who was it designed by?
It was designed by King Henry III.
How much money did he spend?
Henry III spent about 2 years' annual revenue of the whole kingdom on this church. £50,000, it doesn't sound very much now, but it was billions and billions of pounds. And you can see why it was so expensive, because there's decoration everywhere. Colour, marble, height. It's 103 feet from the floor to the top of the vault. No other church in England anywhere near as high. I mean, it was the most magnificent church in the kingdom. Personally, I think it was the most magnificent church in the world.
Why did he go to such lengths to spend so much money?
It's about 2 things. It's about piety, but it's also about power.
Henry III was determined to show that his Westminster wielded much greater power and influence than the city in the east, and that God and his authority ruled supreme.
Everybody sees this church when they come to London. It's here at the centre of everything, the centre of Parliament, the centre of the Exchequer, the law courts, everything functions here.
This is also where the crown shows off its supremacy. All English monarchs since 1066 have been crowned on this site, and there have been 16 royal weddings.
Westminster Abbey is the royal shopfront, and 800 years ago, when King Henry III rebuilt it, that was exactly what he set out to achieve.
It's now one of the most iconic buildings in the world, and a magnificent symbol of the rise of Westminster. But tucked away here in the cloisters, there's something else. A memorial that marks a critical moment in our capital's past, when it faced a catastrophe that would strike both the East and the West and kill half the population.
A disaster so terrible that it would completely change the country.
This is London's Millennium Bridge, a busy pedestrian crossing of the Thames joining Southwark back there with the City of London just up ahead. Now, every day, tens of thousands of people walk this route, going about their daily business.
But just imagine for a moment what it would look like if a deadly disease had ripped through the capital, killing tens of thousands and forcing the rest to flee.
Today, a deserted London is almost unimaginable, but in the 14th century, it was a terrifying reality.
In 1348, bubonic plague arrived in London, and it would change the face of the capital once again. In the space of 18 months, it killed half the city's population. Evidence of just how many Londoners died has been found in plague pits excavated during projects like Crossrail. Some of those unfortunate victims are now in the vaults of the Museum of London, under the care of Jelena Beckverlag.
Who's this?
Well, this lovely person is a male, and he was found in one of the mass burial trenches. The site was prepared, it was purchased by the government to cope with the number of people that were dying of the Black Death.
How many people were buried in the mass graves?
There were probably tens of thousands of individuals that would have been buried on that site.
Tens of thousands, wow.
The Black Death of 1348 was one of the worst catastrophes in human history. It killed a third of the world's population.
After the Black Death had ravaged London, how did the city change and how did life for Londoners change?
What we do know is that actually there was a positive outcome afterwards, that then people did appear to then be healthier. They had better access to good food, so they had better access to meat or fish or vegetables. Conditions for living may then also have been better because you didn't have quite so many people all living in a small space. So there's evidence that actually things may then have improved afterwards.
So if you survived the Black Death, then the chances were you or your children would grow up healthier, stronger, better nourished?
Yes, absolutely.
So despite all the horrors of this devastating pandemic, there were some positive benefits for Londoners.
Black Death opened up opportunities for those who survived. So much so that just 30 years after plague had ripped through the city, London's streets were said to be paved with gold.
There was about to be a new era of prosperity in the capital, and one man's fortune would transform both of London's great centres of power, the City and Westminster. His name was Dick Whittington.
Just 30 years after the Black Death arrived in London and wiped out half of its population, the city experienced yet another dramatic transformation. There were now fewer people competing for positions of power and business was booming, so opportunities opened up for enterprising folk to make their fortunes.
One man is famous for doing just that, and he generously used his fortune to benefit the capital. His name was Richard Whittington, but he's better known to us as Dick Whittington.
Now in pantomime, Whittington's the original poor boy done good, who came to London because he'd heard the streets were paved with gold and ended up making a fortune and becoming mayor, largely thanks to his amazing mouse-catching pet cat. I've always found that legend kind of strange because although Whittington did make a fortune and did become mayor, the journey he took to get there was very different from the one we think we know.
No one really knows if Whittington had a cat at all, and he was far from being a street urchin when he arrived in the capital.
Whittington was actually the youngest son of a knight from Gloucestershire. He came to London in the 1370s and got himself apprenticed in the mercer trade. That meant he was selling cloth, and lots of it.
Whittington made a fortune, and he used his wealth to set up a sideline in money lending, and that would help to keep both sides of the capital happy.
Then, as now, money was power, and Whittington had a lot of money. So it was no surprise in 1397 when his status as one of London's leading merchants, combined with his friendship with kings who bought his cloth and borrowed his cash, led to him being installed as London's mayor for the first of 4 terms.
Whittington worked as mayor in the Guildhall, the centre of power in the east, in the old city of London. From here, he ran the city and used his fortune to make sure that it thrived.
Whittington understood that the most important thing that London's richest men could do was to keep the king of the day sweet. If the king was on side, he'd resist the urge to tax the merchants' trade or to interfere with the city's self-government.
And these amazing old loan agreements from the 1400s show how Whittington did that, by lending money to the king.
Now at that time, his patron, the king who'd first appointed him as mayor, Richard II, had just been kicked off the throne. But what's Whittington already doing? Well, as this document shows, he's lending money to Richard's successor, Henry IV. And not only is he lending him money, it's actually secured, as it says here, on the crown jewels. Now, there's not a lot of loyalty on show here from Whittington, but what there is an enormous amount of political pragmatism.
As well as bailing out kings, Whittington used his wealth and influence to improve the capital itself, including paying for the redevelopment of this great hall in the heart of the city.
Now, every time I come into this room, I get goosebumps. This incredible space is the centrepiece of Guildhall, 15th century London's collective symbol of power, prestige and wealth. And it's the product of a redevelopment that was completed in the year 1411, at which point Whittington was about 60 years old. And unsurprisingly, he kicked into the redevelopment fund, and he also paid for a library here out of his own pocket.
But Whittington's generosity also extended to Londoners who were much less fortunate. He paid for public fountains to provide clean drinking water, redeveloped Newgate Prison, and supported the capital's hospitals. But that wasn't all.
Here on the Thames, by what's now Southwark Bridge, Whittington paid for a state-of-the-art public toilet. It could seat 128 on a long dock over the water, where the waste would be washed away twice a day by the tide.
By the 15th century, Whittington's London was still a tale of 2 separate cities, both competing for dominance. The powerful and wealthy old City of London centred around the Guildhall, and not to be outdone, the rapidly growing hub of Westminster, which was still competing to impose its royal influence on London. About 2 miles along the Victoria Embankment from Guildhall, there's a building that, when it was constructed, completely changed the face of London. Westminster Hall. In 1393, Dick Whittington, ever the pragmatist, loaned money to the king so he could make this the most spectacular building in the capital.
Oh wow. Look at this. This is enormous. I feel like an ant in a space like this.
This hall already existed in Westminster, but Whittington's loan paid for the installation of this enormous, unsupported roof.
I think more than anything, it's the height of this hall that's so impressive when you come in. It's absolutely stunning. And the space this affords you is incredible. It's 20 meters across and a good 70 meters long.
The aim was to create a masterpiece, more impressive than any rival building in the City of London.
Even after more than 600 years, Westminster Hall is still one of the largest public interiors in London, alongside some of the capital's grandest railway stations like Waterloo and King's Cross.
So it's not really surprising that ever since its construction, Westminster Hall has taken centre stage in the life of London.
These walls have witnessed some of the most famous events in London's history, and there are a few plaques along the floor here to commemorate them. It was in this cavernous space that William Wallace, aka Braveheart, and would-be terrorist Guy Fawkes were both sentenced to death. It was also where King Charles I learnt that he was to lose his head.
And finally, this magnificent hall played a particularly important role in our story of the growth of the capital.
Back in the 16th century, Westminster Hall hosted the celebrations that ushered in the Tudors, a royal dynasty that gave us two of our most famous monarchs, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. These two rulers would bring a new age of expansion to London, bringing the city and Westminster together, turning London into a single entity that would grow bigger, more crowded, and more powerful than ever before.
For centuries, London's two power centres, that's Westminster, where kings ruled supreme, and the City of London, where merchants controlled the nation's purse strings, were geographically quite distinct.
The two areas, the old city in the east and Westminster in the west, were also divided by the River Fleet. Today it's been paved over, but it once played a pivotal role in the story of London's growth.
Here at Ludgate Circus, I'm actually crossing right over the River Fleet, just as thousands of people do every day, most of them without even knowing they're doing it. But back in Tudor times, below me was a substantial body of water which often flooded. And where we've just walked was a bridge connecting Westminster, a mile or so down there, with the City of London, just up ahead.
According to historian Dr. Matthew Green, the street that crossed the River Fleet became the most important in the capital.
So Matt, where are we right now?
So we're on Fleet Street, which is the world-famous home of the media industry.
And why was this street so important?
Well, if you think about it, we're standing in between the financial centre, the city, which evolved from the old Roman city. Further down there, we've got Westminster, which was the political hub. Fleet Street physically connected the two.
So I guess it's like an artery of power linking the two together.
Yeah, you had all sorts of courtiers and diplomats and merchants, important people whizzing back and forth down this street. And because of that, it became a lightning rod for news and gossip, the world's first information superhighway.
And it was along this vital artery, Fleet Street, that 16th century London began to expand. Buildings sprang up in the green fields between the two great centres, and over the following years, they would become one single entity. Over in Westminster, the King was about to embark on a brand new development that would astound and amaze. It was called Whitehall.
This was a king who threw out the rule book and in so doing transformed London. He was, of course, Henry VIII.
This domineering king had a single-minded ambition to create the largest palace in the known world. But he wouldn't stop there. His insatiable desire for money was about to change the face of London forever.
In 1529, Henry VIII had already been on the throne for 20 years. But his need to father a legitimate male heir, not to mention his wandering eye, meant that he would soon utterly transform the capital.
Henry's impact on London began in an area that is now called Whitehall in Westminster. Today it houses government offices. In the Tudor period, there was an enormous mansion here that belonged to the King's advisor, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey.
In Tudor London, Cardinal Wolsey was the second most influential man after the King. He was Lord Chancellor. He was head of the Catholic Church in England, and he built himself fantastic palaces, palaces practically fit for a king. That was his first mistake. Added to that, in 1529, Henry wanted to marry his mistress, Anne Boleyn, and Wolsey failed to get an annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. That was his second.
In retaliation, Henry had Wolsey charged with treason, and he seized the Cardinal's desirable London residence for himself. He extended it massively, creating his Whitehall Palace. It was incredible, the largest palace in Europe and a new centre of power in the capital.
Tragically, Henry VIII's palace was gutted by fire in 1698, but not all of it was lost. I'm here at the offices of the Ministry of Defence at Whitehall, and I'm very lucky to get access. It's not every day that you can walk in here, but I've been given permission to see something I've never seen before.
This area is off limits to the public, and filming is carefully controlled for security reasons. But I'm going down below the MOD's rather characterless modern corridors to see what remains of Henry VIII's lost palace.
Oh, wow. This is incredible. This is a vaulted chamber. It was Henry VIII's wine cellar from his Whitehall Palace. So this is a palace that dominated this area of London, and this is all that survives of it. This is a place that Henry lived, he was married, he died. And we know that he used to come down to his wine cellars and sit down and gamble at cards with his men. Probably had a glass of wine as well too. And here I am in the space that he would have done that.
This small wine cellar is all that survives of a massive complex of buildings that radically increased the size of Westminster.
By the time it burnt down, Whitehall Palace contained more than 1,500 rooms and stretched over an area from Trafalgar Square down to Downing Street and out to the Thames. In fact, let me show you. This is a modern map of London, and we're here, and it stretched over this whole area here. So let me show you here. So we've got Trafalgar Square, all the way down to Downing Street, out to the Thames, although the Thames was a bit nearer then, and back again. So it covered some 23 acres of prime London real estate.
Henry had created an enormous private playground, but this was just the start. His insatiable greed would go on to utterly change the shape and character of London.
This is Hyde Park. It's one of the capital's most famous open green spaces, and it plays a key role in our story of Tudor London.
This sprawling 650-acre patch of prime London real estate changed hands nearly 500 years ago when Henry VIII seized it from the Catholic Church and turned it into a private hunting park. But that land grab was part of an event that started in the 1530s and radically changed the landscape of our nation and of our capital.
It began when Henry VIII cut England off from the Catholic Church. He then set his sights on taking over all their land.
In the City of London, the church owned more property than anyone else. As much as 60% of the land was held by Catholic monasteries.
Here at the London Metropolitan Archives, there's an etching that shows just how the capital's skyline was dominated by buildings owned by the church.
This is the Flemish artist Anthony van der Vingaard's panorama of London. It was originally created in 1550, and you really do get a sense of the whole of Tudor London stretching out as seen from the south bank of the Thames. Here's London Bridge, we've got St Paul's here, and dotted around really all over the city are monasteries, some of them in prime locations right by the riverfront.
From 1535 onwards, the church's massive London property portfolio was targeted by Henry VIII. In most cases, properties were simply handed over, but for the few who refused to conform to the king's will, there was bloodshed. Like here at Charterhouse in Smithfield.
The site covers about 13 acres, and in the early 1530s it had an annual income of around £640. Today that would be about £250,000. It also had a leader, Prior John Houghton, who strongly disapproved of Henry's sweeping religious changes. And that would be a bad combination.
On the 4th of May 1535, the king's trusted servants were sent to Charterhouse to insist that the prior and his monks acknowledge Henry as the head of the church. Historian Jenny Draper is an expert on what happened next.
Wow. Jenny, this is such a beautiful space, it's hard to imagine anyone not being happy with it. But what was Henry VIII's problem with Charterhouse?
Well, the Charterhouse monks were really popular with the people, so when they didn't agree to his supremacy of the church, it was seen as a real threat to him.
And how did he react to that threat?
The prior, John Houghton, was hanged, drawn and quartered.
Which is not a nice way to go.
It's one of the worst ways you can go. He's taken to Tyburn. He is hanged until he's nearly dead. They cut him down before he asphyxiates. They cut him open here, and they take all his insides out. And then they cut him into quarters.
Right.
His arm was nailed to the door of the Charterhouse.
Now, if I was a monk at Charterhouse and I saw my boss's arm nailed up there, I'm sorry, I'm falling straight into line and I'm taking the oath, right?
Absolutely. Well, that's what I'd do. But it's not what they do. I mean, to them, it's not just a matter of life and death. It's a matter of their souls, their eternal souls. They cannot call Henry the head of the church. It goes completely against their convictions. So most of the monks in the Charterhouse refused to take the oath, even after that. So they're also arrested. They're put in the Tower. And they are starved to death.
Oh. So at that point is the end of Charterhouse as a monastery under Henry VIII?
Yeah, Henry VIII takes hold of the land and the buildings. He uses it as a storage space, essentially. He doesn't ever live here, he just leaves his stuff here.
Wow. So at the end of all this process, Henry's got rid of all the monks who wouldn't do what he said, and he's got Charterhouse. It's kind of a win-win.
For him, yeah.
For him.
Henry's brutal seizure of Charterhouse was the beginning of a land grab that would turn him into the capital's richest property tycoon. He bagged himself hundreds of acres of London, which he then rented out or sold on to the gentry and nobility for a massive profit.
This was a cataclysmic, traumatic time that changed the whole belief system and the landscape of the country. And London, with its unusually high concentration of religious houses, was utterly transformed.
But this ill-fated monastery still had another role to play in the checkered history of London.
In 1558, Elizabeth I, a new Tudor monarch, stayed for a week as a guest here. In fact, she prepared for her coronation in this very chamber. And it was during her reign that London would begin the next stage on its journey to become the capital not just of a nation, but of an empire.
And it was the swashbuckling exploits of Elizabethan adventurers who would lead the way.
In the story of London, Henry VIII's land grab in the 1530s made him a super-rich property tycoon and redrew the map of the city. By the time his daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, took the throne, London was also a thriving port, taking full advantage of its position on the Thames.
Elizabeth was crowned in London in January 1559, and the city that turned out to cheer her was already a trading powerhouse. Every necessity, every luxury that you could think of was coming in and out of London. Wool, wine, timber, pitch, tar, soap, you name it. London was booming, but it was also growing, and fast.
To cope with the increase in trade, the city's docks were expanding, spreading the boundaries of London east along the banks of the river, making the Thames very different from the one we recognise today.
The Elizabethan River Thames was lined with quays and warehouses right along the north bank, from the Tower to London Bridge and beyond. And at riverside hamlets such as Shadwell, Limehouse and Rotherhithe, ships were simply pulled up onto mud berths to be unloaded. London's docklands had really taken off, and where I am now was one of the busiest quays.
But the docks were about to get even busier. London was becoming a global city as the exploits of plucky Elizabethan adventurers like Sir Francis Drake helped to establish the port as a major hub in a network of international trade routes.
In 1581, Deptford became the focus point for the celebration of one of the most famous moments in maritime history, the return of the Golden Hind. 4 years after it had left London, this remarkably unsophisticated vessel had become the first English ship to successfully circumnavigate the globe, and in doing so, turned its captain, Francis Drake, into an A-list celebrity.
Today, you can explore an exact replica of Drake's ship, just as Londoners did on the original vessel 500 years ago.
In 1581, they all came to see the ship that had achieved this magnificent feat of navigation. But more importantly, they wanted to associate themselves with the man who'd brought to London a staggering fortune of plundered gems and gold.
Nowadays, we'd probably call Drake a pirate. Back then, Londoners hailed him as a hero.
During his circumnavigation, Drake seized the Spanish treasure ship making its way back from the Caribbean and liberated it of an incredible hoard consisting of a dozen chests of coins, 26 tons of silver and 40 kilograms of gold. And that was just one of several ships he'd plundered on his voyage.
When the Golden Hind finally arrived back in London, it was enthusiastically met by the nation and a very grateful Queen.
That's because Drake donated half of his looted fortune to Elizabeth. The exact sum of her share is unknown. The Queen made sure it was a state secret, but it's thought to have been enough to pay off the national debt at a single stroke. It's no wonder then that on the 4th of April 1581, Queen Elizabeth had Drake knighted on the deck of the ship that had transformed the fortunes of the crown.
The adventures of the Elizabethan sea dogs like Drake put London on course to become a centre for world trade. But the Queen wanted much more for her capital and country. Here in the Queen's House in Greenwich, there's a portrait that gives us clues to her ambitious intentions.
I love this picture of Elizabeth I. It's such a picture of power and riches. You see the message of her as a virgin queen draped with pearls. You've got the victory over the Spanish Armada. But there's also one other thing about this picture that I love, a detail that people often miss. Look where she's got her hand. It's not on her own country. It's on the Americas, because by the time this painting was completed, Drake had not only sailed around the entire world, he'd inspired his queen and his fellow Englishmen to dream of dominating a brave new world.
London's maritime might would take control of trade routes that stretched from the Americas via the Caribbean to Southeast Asia, importing tobacco, spices and potatoes. And when the East India Trading Company was established in London, it would become the most powerful corporation in history, arguably bigger than Amazon, Apple and Google combined. As London's commercial power grew and the money flooded in, so did people from all over the world, cashing in on the new prosperity.
London's population grew from around 60,000 in 1530 to nearly 500,000 in 1665. But London's success would come at a heavy price.
At the end of the Tudor period, London was famous across the world as a centre for international trade. It had become a magnet for migrants from Europe and all over England, all of them seeking employment and wealth.
In the 13th century, when we began this chapter of the story, London was simply 2 settlements on the Thames, with a population of just 80,000 people. But 3 centuries later, despite the ravages of the plague, that population had exploded by a factor of 6, and close to 500,000 people now called it home. The result was a significant change in the appearance of the city.
And this is what it looked like. London, as this engraving originally from the Times shows us, was still divided into distinct areas of population. So here, north of the Thames, distinguished by all of these spires and the buildings higgledy-piggledy on top of one another, is the city, bounded by the walls. It's what we still call the City of London. Here, on the other side of the river, spreading out from the southern end of London Bridge, where we can see all these traitors' heads rather gruesomely impaled on spikes. Well, this is Southwark. And over here to the west, beyond the limits of this engraving, is Westminster. And that too had expanded, developed and grown.
London was still very much a low-rise city, but it was now crammed full of buildings. And its cramped housing and dense population would turn out to be a lethal combination. In 1665, a massive disaster hit the city, and it arrived on the River Thames.
London's wealth, its booming trade, and its political influence all came ultimately from the wharves and docks that lined this stretch of river. But that same river that had done so much to make the city rich would in 1665 usher in the first disaster that transformed London.
Because as well as valuable goods, the ships arriving here from the continent brought a deadly disease.
The bubonic plague had first come to London with the Black Death of 1348, which killed as much as half the population in the space of a single year. But over the next 300 years, plague returned to Britain 40 times. Sometimes the outbreaks were mild, sometimes they claimed hundreds or even thousands of lives. And in the 1660s, plague returned to the capital with a vengeance.
It started in December 1664, just outside London, when the first plague death was recorded.
These are bills of mortality. They're official government records of the deaths that occurred in London in the year 1664 in 1665, and what they tell us about the spread of plague is something quite extraordinary. This is the first of them. It covers the period Christmas time, 1664. And it's a list of the usual things that people were dying of in the 17th century. So we've got 15 deaths of dropsy, 7 deaths of rickets, 1 death from wind, which I think must be a pretty horrible way to go. 1 person died from the plague, and that occurred in St Giles in the Fields. Then we move on to the summer. Well, now plague deaths have rocketed. There are 470 recorded in a single week, and deaths from consumption and deaths from fever have both gone up. A month later, 2,010 people died of plague, and by the time we get to the end of August, 6,988 people have died of plague in a single week. This is an epidemic of apocalyptic proportions.
As the Great Plague raged throughout the summer, those who could afford to leave the city fled, but hundreds of thousands stayed and died.
One of our best guides to London at the time of the plague is the diarist Samuel Pepys. Now, we know he stayed in the city during the plague because in his diary he kept a grisly log of the numbers of people who died. He writes that up to 6,000 people died every week, and all you could hear day and night was bells tolling for the dead. Now, by 1666, the population of London had fallen by between 1/4 and 1/3, but there was much, much worse to come.
In the 1660s, London streets were lined with Elizabethan townhouses, like these distinctive black and white half-timbered style buildings.
You've got leaded windows, those diagonal and horizontal wooden beams, and that characteristic overhanging first floor. But these are timber-framed buildings with open fireplaces, and in an age before modern building regs and health and safety, that was going to prove a deadly recipe.
So far on our 1600-year journey, we've seen a small settlement on the banks of the Thames grow to become the capital of England. We've witnessed how the old city and Westminster came together to create one centre of power.
And in the next chapter of our story, we'll reveal how London's cramped housing and timber buildings would cause the almost total devastation of the city. The Great Fire would leave only 20% of the city standing. But miraculously, a grand new London would emerge from the ashes.
And catch that next Tuesday at 9:15. Making life or death decisions, meet the elite team of medics who see it all in a major new series, Critical Condition, starting tomorrow at 9. Next, it's the final night in the Villa, so everyone's going to play nice, right? Don't bet on it. It's all kicking off in new Bachelor UK.